Welcome to the Higher Ed Happy Hour podcast, brought to you by Unincorporated, a higher education agency committed to building awareness and growing enrollment for universities. This podcast provides deans, senior admin, and faculty with the tools, resources, and information they need to grow student interest, design branded content, and launch new programs and courses. In this episode, Ian spoke with Anushka Sapra, who is the Assistant Director of Admissions at the Office of Undergraduate Admissions at Northeastern University. Anushka shares how she has grown admissions at her university and some of the things she's learned along the way. But one small note for our listeners, the views expressed in this episode are from our guests' personal experience and may not reflect the specific views and opinions of Northeastern University. Let's get into the episode.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Higher Ed Happy Hour. This is Ian from Unincorporated, and as the intro mentioned, I'm here with Anushka Sapra, who is the Assistant Director of Admissions at the Office of Undergraduate Admissions at Northeastern University. In this episode, we're going to hear directly from her, a successful higher education professional who has grown admissions at one of the leading universities. Anushka, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ian. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you a little bit more about my experience.
Yeah, it is a pleasure to have you. So often we hear from experts who have either written books, published papers, focused on marketing and branding in a wide variety of industries, and they're kind of applying their thinking to higher ed. So it's rare, really, and a treat to have someone in the trenches sharing their direct experience and providing that specific practical knowledge on how to grow enrollments. So it's a pleasure to have you. Let's start things off with general process. Tell us about the general process of admissions at Northeastern. Can you walk us through maybe what a typical student goes through from application to acceptance?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, I do want to start out by mentioning that I'm wrapping up on my first year at Northeastern University coming up this October, and I am about a year out from undergrad. So I do not have the experience that a lot of my colleagues do who've been in admissions for several years now. But from my experience working at the university over this past year, and like you said, being in the trenches with admissions at a pretty selective school, I think the process, of course, begins once the student submits the application. There's so many different deadlines depending on the kind of application that the student wants to submit. But once they do that, we have a process of reading the apps, of course. And so every admissions counselor kind of gets a certain number of applications assigned to them. The hope is that we read applications coming directly from the regions that we manage, but we do see a fair amount of reading that takes place for other regions that we don't manage as well. But we are in heavy contact with the territory manager to make sure that we're most up to date with the happenings at the particular school that we're reading for and that region. So we're making decisions in the context of the application where it's coming from. So the application goes through a process of reading. And then once our applications have been read, we go into committee, which is essentially when decisions are made. Every territory manager has the opportunity to first look through their roster. When those are the applications coming from their region, that's what makes up the roster, and put decisions on that they feel is accurate based off of the readings that have happened, all of the comments that have been made on the file, and everyone who's had a chance to look at the file, their thoughts about it. And then once those decisions are on there, committee takes place and we brainstorm, go back and forth, see if we need to change any of the decisions. There's a lot of conversation, and that's been one of my favorite. This process so far has been the discussion that takes place in committee rooms. And yeah, once after that, decisions are made. We wait until we have decisions on everyone who applied in that particular round, and then decisions are released. And then after that, we hope that students accept their offer. That
is very nicely laid out. I'm impressed by the fact that it is manual. It's a manual process, but with that comes a lot of care, a lot of direct discussion and consideration. And so there's like this level of personalization and like kind of nurturing that happens in this process. So I think the care that you're putting into this process probably speaks to the growing enrollment numbers and probably that high acceptance rate that you get once you have an admitted student. So this being your first year, I mean, you're speaking like a true pro. How did you know like you wanted to go into admissions, or how did you decide to be involved in admissions in the first place?
So to be brutally honest, I didn't know that I wanted to be involved with admissions. My first exposure to the world of college admissions was my on-campus job at the school I went to undergrad at, which is the University of Southern California out in Los Angeles. And I see you doing the fight on. Yep, we have an alum in the house. So yeah, so when I was a student there, I was looking for an on-campus job, much like a lot of other students. Being an international student, I had some restrictions on where I could work as a job. There's some rules and stipulations that mandate that you have to be working for the university in the capacity of a job. You can't really, for example, I can't just work at a Starbucks or something like that. I have to work for the university in some capacity. So I was looking for jobs that fit that requirement and came across the USC Admissions Center, which was hiring tour guides and student ambassadors. I was someone who didn't have a lot of help going through the college admissions process myself, whether that's being an international applicant, but also going to a school where it wasn't very common for students to come abroad for their higher education. I didn't really have a guidance counselor and someone to assist me with that. I'm the older sibling in my household, so my parents have never been through the process either. So I was just very new to the whole world, even when I went through the application process. And I remember feeling like I would have loved to have some assistance through it. It's just such a rigorous and demanding and long, tedious process. So that was my motivation to apply to be a tour guide. I wanted to have conversations with prospective students and be helpful to them through their college search process, and essentially be the resource that I never had. And I was successful in my job application there. I ended up working at the admission center for all 4 years of undergrad. I had some leadership positions while I was there as well. And I just really, really enjoyed the work. I loved speaking to prospective students. I found it super interesting, the process itself. Granted, I wasn't doing any kind of reading or evaluation in the capacity of a tour guide, but I was exposed to the whole process just by having conversations with the college admissions counselors at USC. So after that, I finished up my senior year of undergrad entirely online during the pandemic. And I graduated in May 2021. My original plan was to go to graduate school. I just, personally felt incredibly burnt out in a way that I had never felt before. I've always loved school and thrived in that environment, but I was so jaded and exhausted academically that I didn't feel like it was the right headspace for me to enter a graduate program in, which would have probably also started online. So I decided to defer my acceptance and look at different jobs that I could do. I was also pretty certain that I didn't really want to do anything that was related to my academic interests. I studied economics and international relations. I wanted to get into policy and research. I wasn't ready to be doing anything even remotely related to my academic interests. That's how jaded and burnt out I was. So I decided to tap into the other skill that I had developed over 4 years of working at the admission center, which was this kind of a role, working in admissions at a university. And Northeastern happened to be hiring, and that's how it came about. So yeah, definitely a roundabout path. Haven't been someone who's always wanted to be in higher ed, but now that I'm here, I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, I love this quote that you provided. You want to be the resource that you never had. So that is a great driver. What a great piece of motivation there. And in a way, you're doing international relations, right?
I am, in a way. Yeah, I guess you could say that I am building relationships with counselors and schools and students who are based internationally. So I never thought about it that way. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it's just a delight to hear that you're enjoying the work, which I'm sure gets transferred, right? That sense of enjoyment that you have in your own work probably translates nicely into the process. And I'm sure that the students feel that on the other end, especially when it comes times to speaking with people and maybe getting that final letter of acceptance. Does it feel natural to you now that you've landed in this career path? You said it wasn't quite aligned with your academic interests and you're only a year out of the gate, but does it feel like a natural fit now?
It does in a lot of ways. I think that I'm learning to embrace skills and practicing skills that come naturally to me and not always feel like I need to be I am still challenged in this role, but I'm learning to embrace the fact that I don't need to always be way outside my comfort zone to feel satisfied and rewarded with the work that I'm doing. I think there's a fine balance to that. I'm a Leo. I enjoy a challenge. I work well with in a goal-oriented workspace, which all of this is definitely true for the work that I'm doing here, but it does feel natural to me. So you're absolutely right. I feel like I'm able to flex my public speaking skills. I'm able to flex my relationship building skills, and I'm able to really hone into some of the things I enjoy most doing, which is being helpful to others going through a process that is really difficult to understand. I'm really good, I think, at being able to translate material and information in a way that is easy to understand and be digestible, which is so important if you're a family going through the college admissions process, that maybe you're the first person in your family to go through that process. Maybe you don't have access to resources that can assist you with it. There's so much jargon and vocabulary and vernacular used in this field that often goes over people's heads. So I really enjoy the process of breaking down these complex processes and making it manageable and doable for the people I'm working with.
Yeah. So we're going to dig into some of like your key ingredients of success, which I think you touched upon there a little bit. But tell us about the success that you've had. Your admissions process, I know from previous conversations, is actually very finely tuned and puts up some great numbers, some great enrollment numbers. So tell us just a little bit about the success that you've had.
Yeah, so it's definitely been a really interesting year to start out in this field and to start out at Northeastern. I think we as a university have seen some unprecedented growth in the number of applications. We actually received over 90,000 applications this past cycle, which is the most that we've ever received. I'm pretty sure it's up there in terms of the number of applications that any university on the East Coast has received. And it's just really humbling it's an embarrassment of riches, truly. The application pool is just full of students who are so outstanding and so incredible that it's truly humbling to be in this kind of a role where you get to read the applications and speak with students who are so capable. So we did receive over 90,000 apps. Like I said, our acceptance rate was actually just about 7%, which is, again, crazy low for Northeastern. From my personal knowledge of the university from the outside, I've always known Northeastern to be hovering in the 15 to 20% acceptance range. So a sort of a drop to 7% is really crazy. And we did yield over 40% of our class that we admitted. So that is also super exciting. And we've usually also been in the 20s, I think, with regards to yield. So we've definitely seen a growth there as well. It's really exciting to see that, we are able to be successful in bringing the students who were admitted to campus and be excited about their offer and provide them with the assistance that they need while they're going through the decision-making process.
Wow. So we know as higher ed professionals that as the acceptance rate goes down, that means you're getting a higher quality student. And that pool of interested students, the quality is increasing. You also have a 40% yield, which means even with those coveted best fit students, you're actually able to capture their attention and, dare I say, convince them, persuade them to finally choose Northeastern over, another competitive university. So kudos on both of those numbers. Those are key indicators of success. Tell us how. How have you been able to drive this level of success?
Well, I don't think it has honestly anything to do with me. I think it's just that the team that we have at the university is so incredible, and the folks working in the Office of Undergraduate Admissions care so much about the students that they are working with. And I think that really helps all of the relationships that the team builds with students all over the world. And that translates to a better experience for them through the admissions process. And then that therefore impacts the outcome. I would have to work at Northeastern for a few more years to be able to truly comment on what are the specific policies that we're seeing as being successful, just because for me, like I said, this is my first year. So everything that happened is all I know. But, if we do have this conversation again, hopefully in a couple of years, I'll be able to weigh in a little bit more about specifics. But overall, I do think it is really the people on the team and the interactions and the care with which they have those interactions with the students they work with.
Yeah. Well, you said earlier a few things that I think you are directly responsible for, which are you are simplifying the process, maybe taking things a little slower, not trying to rush people into a decision. You're communicating value propositions and reasons why to join this university over others or this program over others in a very clear way. So you're communicating clearly, and you're also making the families and the applicants feel heard and giving them the sense that they matter. So I think all of that personal one-to-one relationship building is translating nicely into your contribution to the team. That said, if you had one piece of advice to give to other admissions teams who might maybe be struggling with their enrollment numbers or concerned that they've seen a plateau or even a dip in the quality of applicant or quality of conversion, what would you say to them? What kind of advice would you give to them?
Oh gosh, I don't know if at the age of 22 I'm qualified to give anyone advice.
It's the fresh perspective oftentimes that people, I think, do appreciate and desire.
Okay, so personally for me, what I think we do really well that could maybe be taken on board by other universities, and something that I notice is different, is really just sort of accepting the fact that once you get into the top 50 universities, bucket pool in the US, they're all incredible institutions. And for the most part, they're all offering a wide range of amazing programs with really, renowned faculty, a really thriving student body. It's probably a certain level of competitiveness to the process just by being in that top 50 bucket. So I think embracing the fact that the peers in this space that we have are also such great universities that it's super important to be really frank with the students you're working with about what the value add of your university is and what makes the experience that you're offering to your undergraduate students different from the one that they could find at any of those other 49. So I think that is where working at Northeastern has truly been a treat, is because it is such a distinctive undergraduate experience with the experiential learning focus that every single undergraduate student has as an integrated part of their undergraduate experience. I think that really allows us to be able to leverage that and be able to be really candid in our conversations with students about setting up expectations of what their college career at Northeastern could look like, so that we only really end up exciting the students who are wanting that kind of experience, and then they end up applying, and then they end up, enrolling. I think that is really helpful. So having that really great understanding of what the value add of your university is, and being open and honest about the fact that students can probably have an incredible college experience at any of those schools, right? They're all fantastic institutions. It just ultimately boils down to these finer details, these niche aspects that make universities special, that opportunities that they offer that others don't, and really capitalizing on using that to attract the right kind of student.
I love that. So I'm going to try to just paraphrase what you said here for simplicity's sake. But be frank, be candid in these conversations. I love that piece of advice. Be clear on the value that you bring as an institution. Own, and I love this one too, own who you are, right? Really embrace kind of the nuance of what makes you different compared to your competitors. And be comfortable with the fact that they may go on to choose one of the other top 50 universities. So all of that is just really sound advice.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think the last bit that you mentioned about them, maybe moving forth and accepting another offer, I think in a lot of ways that's a win for us as well. Ultimately, it's really important that, and for me as someone who's recently entered this space, is to have that separation between working for Northeastern, but ultimately being an admissions counselor and really just wanting what's best for the student. And if that leads them to a university that's not Northeastern, that's also just equally a success for all of us in the space, that we've been able to inform a student enough that they're able to make a choice that feels right for them. And you ultimately want students who are at a university because they want to be there for the reasons things that you have shared as being the value add of the university. So I think that ultimately it's a success for everyone, regardless of where a student ends up. And yeah, I've definitely had conversations with students where I've had to be brutally honest and say that maybe this other offer that they have is a better choice for them based off of what they're looking for from their undergraduate experience. And that is where you put on your admissions counselor cap and not your Northeastern person cap, which is really fun to do sometimes.
Yeah. And I think that altruistic point of view that you just shared, like, hey, although we're competing for the best fit student, we are also a global community helping students thrive and ascend and become better versions of themselves. That altruistic point of view probably also helps you not come off like salesy or pushy. And I bet students and families can also feel that. So I think that's a great point. It's one that I've quite frankly never heard before. People saying like, yay, us, we were able to help them find the university that fits them best, even though they didn't choose us.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you.
Another passion of yours includes ensuring that you get a very diverse pool of applicants and admitted students, that the process is accessible and that it's inclusive. So how do those, I guess, passions or, kind of key drivers also play into your role?
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, for me, and I know that this is a priority for my colleagues on the team as well, is really, really trying to focus in on recruiting from places that we haven't recruited before. So I think, the cycle is such, and I don't know how good or not this is, but typically universities tend to go back to the places where they've gotten a lot of applications from, a lot of successful applications from, and where they've seen a lot of students actually commit and enroll at the university. And it is ultimately, I guess, in the university's interest to continue to go back to those places, which I think is, it's incredibly valid. However, I think that to be able to truly build an inclusive environment on a college campus, you need students from places where we haven't had students come from before. And that means prioritizing diversity in our recruitment travel, prioritizing going to places that we haven't been to before, schools and regions that we haven't traveled to before, and being resources for higher education as opposed to being resources for Northeastern. And I think that ultimately when you do that part of the role well, it leads to success for the university as well. So I think that is something that I've seen a lot of efforts being made at the university. Something that I try to do a lot as well is to go beyond just where we've been to before, go beyond the template of places that I need to be hitting as, relationship schools, schools that have worked really well with us in the past, regions that we know that we have a high enrollment rate from. Going beyond that, because until you break that cycle, you're going to keep enrolling the same kind of student. And then that's not really fair and equitable to students from all over the world who are just as good of a fit for the university, just as capable, but just are either identify as communities where that have been historically underrepresented in higher education, or are so essentially focusing on multi-identity based recruitment is one space that I really try to champion my passions in enrolling a diverse class. And I think ultimately context is key. So one of the great ways that we as an office do the process, and I know that this is similar to many other universities as well, is we operate on a territory management basis, which is every admissions counselor is also inherently a territory manager, in that they are the primary point of contact, they are the primary recruiter, as well as person responsible for the application evaluation and selection process for students from those regions. So through that process, we're able to develop a greater understanding of the region that we're dealing with, and therefore that allows us to evaluate applications equitably and evaluate applications in the context from which they're coming from, so that we're not comparing students from vastly different experiences and backgrounds, because that just simply wouldn't result in any kind of success for us as a university.
Yeah, I think that's oftentimes EDI, like equity, diversity, and inclusion, that can be almost lip service, right? Because there is a risk, as you're mentioning, like maybe not going back to the same communities or the same like geo targets, and looking outside of that in order to own up to that mission. So I think, or that initiative. So I feel like you're really putting your actions where your words are, and not just giving that lip service that sometimes, maybe a university is saying, oh, we want a diverse population of incoming students, but we're not willing to take the risk to look or recruit from other geographies or other communities.
Right, absolutely. And that being said, I don't think we're anywhere where we need to be, even anywhere near where we need to be at all as a university. I mean, Northeastern still is very much a predominantly white institution with a lot of work to be done in the EDI space. And it is something that needs to be taken up by the university at multiple different levels. So it exists as a real priority for higher administration at the university, but it's also equally important for us at the grassroots level as admissions counselors to be doing that work as well. So it has to be a two-pronged approach, and it is very much the approach that the university follows, but I do think that there's a long road to take and a journey to take, essentially. And again, that's something that I think we have to be super open and honest about. A conversation like this really can't take place unless universities and the people working at those institutions are forthcoming about the flaws and the areas that the university is lacking in and the work that needs to be done. So yeah, I have absolutely no problems calling that out. I mentioned it in all of my information sessions, just so again, you're making sure the student knows that you respect them enough to be open and honest about where the university is at in their EDI efforts.
Yeah, that goes back to one of your earlier points, which is really to own who you are as an institution, but also do some vision casting of where you want to be. And maybe they see themselves in that story, right? That prospective student can actually not only really appreciate it, but then also feel like they're part of the change, which is super empowering.
Absolutely.
And now we're going to take a quick break. Want more of the most important higher ed news, insights, and perspectives, but don't have time to look for it? Visit unincorporated.com to subscribe to our higher education news brief, where you'll get the top stories in higher ed delivered straight to your inbox every Monday. And now, back to the discussion.
So what other misconceptions have you run into? Did you have any misconceptions going into like how admissions and recruitment works? And if so, like what are some of those misconceptions that you've encountered?
There's definitely a few, but the one that stands out to me the most is a misconception that I too had going through the process, which is this certain conception of admissions counselors as, I don't know, these C-suite executives who walk around in, full suits, on calls all the time and sit in a boardroom and make all of these important decisions about who's going to be admitted and who's not going to be. And I don't know why I kind of envisioned it. It played out like the TV show Suits in my mind. That's what I envisioned everyone looked like in that space. And it couldn't be further from the truth. And I think for the better, honestly, just because now having conversations with admissions counselors at USC when I was a tour guide and now being one myself, we're just people, right? Like at the end of the day, admissions counselors are people who are deeply passionate about higher education and the opportunities that their university can provide for a student, and the doors that a higher education itself can open for students. And then more than that, they're obviously, of course, trained in the application process and being that resource that they need to be, but they're still just people wearing normal clothes, having very normal conversations with each other, doing a lot of the work independently and then together as a team. But it's very much not the C-suite idea that I had in my mind, and not as cookie cutter, very formal that I think I envision the process and the people that work in the process as being. And I'm so glad that it is this way, because it adds that human touch. It makes you truly feel like a counselor, and you see it in the students' eyes when they talk with you. It kind of blows their mind that they're speaking directly with the person that is going to be reading their application. And that is just so important to dismantle those misconceptions, because there doesn't need to be separation between the student and the person reading their application. And that's the reality of it, is that there isn't. You can directly email and talk with your admissions counselor. And that is something that I just did not understand when I was going through the process. And I'm so grateful that it's not the way I thought it was.
Yeah. The picture you paint, it's like this ivory tower, filled with suits and, men with wigs on, right? Like,
I don't know why though, but I think, I mean, a part of it is definitely my own imagination, but a part of it is also just the very formulaic approach to admissions that it feels like when you're a student going through the process, it feels like such a daunting process that could most likely end up in just complete rejection because of how selective universities are becoming and how difficult it is to even navigate the process. I don't think it's necessarily the student's fault for imagining it to be these kind of people on the other side of the desk, because that's how rigorous the experience is. So I don't blame them at all, but it's definitely important for hopefully whoever listens to this podcast now knows that it's people in t-shirts and pants and very much just, going through the same problems that you are as a person. They're just other individuals that are trained in this specific skill set. It's not really, you're not playing God when you make admissions decisions for a student, even though it feels like that when you're on the student side of things. And I know that firsthand. I mean, I went through the process 5 years ago. So yeah, I truly understand that.
Yeah. And I think just considering our listener audience being senior administration at universities, they can embrace that empathy that there is this misconception from the student perspective. So how do you kind of break down that barrier? How do you immediately start to communicate that this is a one-to-one conversation? I am a real person. Maybe I'm wearing a collared shirt, but not a suit necessarily.
Yeah.
And I do care about your success. So just having that empathy going into those conversations, I think is a great piece of actionable advice for those listening. Given your success, we've, I think, covered that to a good degree. How do we now evaluate the challenges that you've had? What type of challenges have appeared maybe in your first year, and what kind of challenges are you looking at or anticipating moving forward?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest challenges that I faced is having to learn to say no and having to learn to be okay with saying no so many more times than I can say yes. And that is a product of having the privilege of working at a university that receives so many incredibly qualified applications. It's kind of like what I mentioned before. It truly is an embarrassment of riches when you look at the applicant pool and you have to make some really, really difficult choices. And that feels really hard at times. There's moments where I have to really reckon with myself and remind myself of why I'm here and the ways that I try to get myself through moments where I am really challenged by the fact that I'm having to say no when the people pleaser in me, all she wants to do is say yes, but I can't. The way that I try to get through that is by really having belief in this process and having a really strong sense of empathy for the student, but ultimately overall a real appreciation and respect and belief in the process, and that it is going to lead the student to the institution that is right for them, even if it doesn't feel like that at every step of the way. Ultimately, I think that you have to have that belief, because without that, and if you don't trust the process, it can be so difficult at times to have to make decisions that are so difficult, to have to say no so many more times than you can say yes. And I think that has been a journey of personal growth for me that I've had to undergo over the past year. And I don't think it's going to get any easier. And I think every single year, it's just sort of reminding yourself as to why you're here and keeping it very much grassroots, in that you're drawing your satisfaction and your sense of fulfillment from the conversations that you're having with students as a counselor, with the goal that you're leading them towards the option that is right for them, even if that means saying no to them as a Northeastern employee.
Yeah, that's a really fair answer, and again speaks to your altruistic view of life and your role there at the university. How about the challenge that some admin teams might feel around not having the numbers maybe to give as much personalization as they'd like to? There's obviously a lot of cuts that we're seeing in higher ed, both from a financial standpoint, but also from a head count. So any advice, and I want to qualify this, that, maybe this isn't something you could speak to directly, but given the fact that there are some admissions teams who don't have the time to give the care that's needed in this process, or that they would want in this process, what advice might you have for them?
That's a really great question. And while I, again, don't think I can speak to it personally, I think just being honest about that. I think finding a way to be really candid without going against the interests of the university and simultaneously serving the interests of the students. I think that fine balance that all of us, that fine line that we all have to walk, I think stems from just being honest and open and trusting the fact that if you do that, you are in a way serving the student the way they should be served. Because no one wants to be given all of these, false platitudes and all of these words of that don't really mean anything if they're not grounded in truth. And if your resources are super restricted, then being honest about that, being realistic about what you can do for a student, setting up expectations that you can actually meet. Not every school has to operate on this one-to-one customer relationship that we try to have. And that's part of the game. You have to be super realistic about what you can do. And then once you are realistic with yourself, I think communicating that expectation to the students you're dealing with, to the families you're talking to the counselors that you're working with on the other side of the desk, the high school counselors, I think that is just sort of fundamentally advice I think that I don't think I'm qualified to give, but from an outsider, I think that that's what I would say.
Yeah. How about automation? Do you think that's effective? Like using email workflows and sequences that try to pretend like there's a human there, and these timed follow-ups and videos that might meet certain behaviors, like a student hitting different parts of a website, then receive different email threads or email communications. Do you think automation can help in this regard as well?
I think in terms of providing information overall, I think automation definitely helps, especially when you're dealing with numbers like 90,000 applications. But I do think having the avenue for them to be able to directly speak with a person on the other side is super, super important as well. So for us, we have a general admissions inbox that every student that has a query through the process can email, and then there's all of us working in the inbox. But when there's a question that is really specific to a particular situation that the student is going through, that email gets sent directly to the admissions counselor for that region so that they can answer that question and they can advise and counsel the student in a way that is most appropriate because they have the most understanding and knowledge of the region. So I think that level of providing both is really, really important. And it's the only way to maintain your sanity through the process as a person, but also be able to serve the community that you really want to serve, which is the students. And I do think that, once students have access to their application status check portal, that's what we call it, but generally a portal that students can create once they've submitted an application where they get to monitor and make sure that all of the requirements have been met. We've received all the documents we needed to make sure that all of that is good. That's typically where they can directly find the email for the counselor that reads for them as well. So that reduces the number of students that are directly reaching out to a counselor to only reaching out when you are from the region that the counselor is dealing with. So I think little ways to make sure that a student is able to, if they really need to, talk to a person, but also get most of the information they need from automated sources, which I think is, again, a fine balance. Personally, for me, I always like to remind students that most of the information that they are looking for, they can get on Google. So to really have that kind of empathy on their side as well, since it is just people on the other side of the desk who are reading applications, answering their emails. If there's something that you can find online, maybe just do that as opposed to sending the email. But if there is something that you truly need help with, absolutely reach out through the avenue that gets you to talk directly to a person.
Wonderful. Very, very astute answer there. So a couple more questions. We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you again for all of this insight. But I wanted to make sure we covered the aspect of English language policies and how that impacts the admissions process. Can you share a little bit about what that means and what your goals might be, your personal goals of changing some of those policies?
I think as someone who went through the process of applying to universities in the US from outside the US as an international student, and this is nothing to do with Northeastern, just generally universities in the US that have English as the primary language of instruction in their classes, look for students who have a certain level of English proficiency when admitting them. There's lots of different ways that universities try to seek out that information from the applicant, whether it's by asking them to either declare English as their native language or indicate that their primary language of instruction all through high school has been English, or by asking them to take an English language test, which can be one of the many ones that are available, and then receiving those scores and being able to use that to determine a level of proficiency. Which obviously there's a huge amount of merit to being able to do that, because again, you don't want a student to feel lost once they're at a university if they're not able to really learn in the classroom because they're not able to speak the language that the class is being taught, and that would be a disservice to the students. So I fully understand why universities have that as a criteria in their evaluation. But I do think, I think there's so much changing around the world. And I think the English language testing policy really needs to just keep up with that kind of change. I definitely find the policy at Northeastern to be really great in that it is very customized. It's very much so, there's lots of avenues and options for students to be able to demonstrate their English language proficiency. And for students that we feel like we need more information from, there truly is a student-to-student, one-to-one basis on which those cases are looked at, and conversations are started with those students to be able to see if we can get the more information than what we already have. So I see a lot of pros to Northeastern's way of doing it. Just personally, as someone who grew up in a post-colonial country where everyone speaks English, or at least knows English, and most of us are educated in English. I grew up, speaking English. I was educated in English all the way through K through 12. Sometimes it's a little bit funny when you're asked to submit English language testing to prove that you can speak a language that pretty much everyone in the country speaks. So it's more so about finding ways of meeting students where they're at, understanding different national curriculum systems and the level of English that is spoken and in those systems, and that is taught in those systems, and then being able to translate what that means for the level of English spoken at the university in classrooms, and be able to draw parallels and see which students can be exempt from the process and which students can't. So I just think that there's more so the need for updating the policy to meet the world where it's at right now, at least from other universities that I look at. Some work to be done for Northeastern as well, of course, but I do think that we're further along the journey in terms of having a really customized English language proficiency process, as opposed to other universities.
Great answer. And I get the sense that you are a true visionary. We're going to be hearing more and more from you, maybe a book coming out in the years ahead. So as we look to close, any final words, any last, I guess you have my ear, you have the ears of everyone listening. Any final advice or key takeaways you want to share with the listeners?
Well, this is me as an individual, just speaking with anyone that might be listening to this podcast. This entire episode has been me as an individual speaking and sharing my experience. But I truly think, as someone who's gone through the process myself, someone who's seen it from a tour guide perspective, wherein I'm just trying to provide as much information about a university and resources as I can to students. And then now having spent a year working in the profession and working in this industry, I think that truly, to be brutally honest, the college that you end up going to, in my opinion, is the lesser issue, right? I just think that this gets blown way out of proportion. And I think that students can have a really, really incredible education, no matter what school they decide to attend, whether that's the top 10, the top 20, the top 50, the top 100, or even beyond that. I think that the experience that students have in undergrad is beautiful and is incredible because of the people that they meet, the conversations that they have, the spaces that they have access to that they maybe haven't had in the past, and all the growth that takes place on an individual level. That's what makes the college experience in the US, at least for me, so special, is that these universities that exist provide spaces for students to be able to grow individually, which is not the reality in a lot of other education systems. So I do think that the school is the secondary concern. Whichever school you end up at, I think it's the people you meet that really make your experience what it is, and that your decisions and your reasons for picking a school are so personal and specific to you that you don't need to justify them to anybody else. I feel like, going beyond just the rankings and stats and feeling like you need to pick the school that is the most selective to really demonstrate your success as a student is just not true. I think that picking a university is such a personal decision. And ultimately, it should be for reasons that make sense to you, whether that's for the program that you want to study, whether that's financially, it makes the most sense for you, whether it's the closest to your family. And after going through a global pandemic and still being in one, it's really important for you to stay close to home. All of these are valid reasons for deciding where you want to go to school, and no one, not even an admissions counselor, should be able to provide you with the answer to something like that. It really just has to be a personal choice. So yeah, I hope anyone who's listening to this, if you are someone who's going through the process yourself, you know that no matter what school you end up at, you can make the process incredible and you can make the journey at that school incredible. And make the admissions counselors at the school that you're looking at, or the ones that you're working with through this process, serve you and your needs, because it's all about the student. At the end of the day, we are truly here for the students. So ask for what you need and demand it. And hopefully those schools can rise up and meet you where you're at.
Anushka, thank you. That was just so well said. You've shared your passion, your insights, your commitment, and given us a lot of practical advice along the way. It's hard to believe you're only 1 year out of the gates, but I have really enjoyed this discussion, and just thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Ian. I appreciated the opportunity to do this, and I had so much fun, so thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to the Higher Ed Happy Hour podcast. For more higher ed specific resources, or if you'd like to be a guest on the show, please visit unincorporated.com.